Hello, everyone. I'm going to get things underway because I made way too many slides. So I'm going to need to do like 2 or 3 slides per minute. We'll see how it goes. But thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the crowd, at least one of whom actually participated in one of the games I'm going to be talking about. So that's awesome. So this is a talk about the life we have left to live. That's the name of the game that I designed. And it's going to be about death positive narrative design. So the life we have left to live is a live action game. So lots of nice like physical components and printed handouts. And it has elements of role play. I'm not quite calling it a LARP. It has elements of role play though. And it also has a scavenger hunt mechanic. So the idea is that those two pieces, the role play and the scavenger hunt mechanic, work together to create a meaningful and accessible encounter with death. But there were a lot of question marks around how that would actually play out, and also whether it would be fun to be a part of. So this is going to be a little bit of a design talk, a little bit of a post-mortem, have to make the mortem joke. So first, I'll kind of describe my motivations for all of this. I'll do a little bit of a history of death in games and kind of primer on death positivity. I'm by no means an expert on these topics, and I feel like it's possible some of you are, so bear with me. I'm still learning. And yeah, then I'll talk about actually designing the main game and then playtesting, which is kind of secretly a story about designing a whole other set of games that were used kind of retroactively to better understand the original game. Yeah, and then the postmortem where we reflect on what to take away from it all and what it all means. All right. I promised you I would use this picture, not. I'm Elana. I almost labeled this, and this is future Elana. This is what I think about after 11 p.m. Yeah, I'm not sure why I have this fixation on death. I think everyone does to some degree, but it haunts me just a little extra. So I have a rule with my friends that after 11 p.m., if we're hanging out, there's no talking about death. And that's something that I wanted to work on. So just a little bit about me quickly. I'm one of the founding members of Unquiet Games, along with Nat Mesnard. We gave a talk last year at NarraScope that some of you may remember. I am the lead technical designer for the studio. I also do some design advising for Bolero Game Studio. And for a while, I had an arcade installation at Wonderville. I'm not sure if it's still there, but that was always a cool thing to be able to say. And occasionally, when I'm not doing video games, I do live action games. So this is an escape room that I worked on some years back. And I also wrote a parlor LARP for about 15 players a little bit more recently. So I love to dabble in this sort of thing, even though it's not the central focus of my career. All right, so back to the death thing. So I have this preoccupation with death and I wanted to be able to talk about it. Thought maybe that would be helpful. However, not everyone loves to talk about death all of the time. And I wasn't really sure how to approach that conversation. And I think the more I talked about wanting to talk about it, the more worried my partner got about like, what is this whole death conversation? So I started thinking about other ways to approach it than just like scheduling a conversation in a very open-ended way. So the first attempt was to do zine making. And this was just the two of us. This was just my partner and me. And we just basically went through kind of prompting each other with questions about death, taking a few minutes to write down an answer, journal about it, illustrate it. And it was actually a pretty good start. it did, like, it made it approachable. It offered a concrete structure. However, we were kind of very much in our own lanes while working on these scenes. And while, conversation was invited, it wasn't built into the activity in any particular way. So it still left me wanting more and wondering, oh, the emojis aren't showing up, but could game design help? All right. So a little history of death in game. I think there are two main ways that the concept of death manifests. There are mechanical deaths and narrative deaths. I hear there have been a lot of Venn diagrams today. I've got another one for you. So the mechanical death is the one that I'm not going to talk very much about. I also didn't put many examples in here because it's like almost every video game that exists has like a mechanic of death. Some do more interesting things with like how the save points are spaced out or how you recover like loot that you've lost. But really what I want to be talking about today is death that's a part of the story, not necessarily even something that like manifests to like not something that you are driven as a player to be inflicting or avoiding. So here are a couple of great examples of that. And there are some games that do really interesting things at the intersection of the two. I wanted to add the missing here because that's one of the games that Query talked about in the keynote. And while I'm not big on horror games personally, I thought it was doing some interesting things with the like self-mutilation as a mechanic that also has narrative underpinning. So yeah, if you want to learn more about death as a mechanic, there are lots of design videos on that. This is a pretty good one. It's old Game Maker's Toolkit, but that's not what I'm talking about. This is more in line with what I'm talking about. And this is another talk I would recommend that I'm referring you all to by Gabby D'Arienzo. It's a GDC talk from 2018. And she is the designer of Mortician's Tale. And she did a really good job of talking about death in games up to that point. So she created A Mortician's Tale and also more recently Seasonella Cemetery, which I think just came out in the last month. I haven't had a chance to play it yet, but it's another very explicitly death positive game. And she also has a great podcast called Play Dead. I thought I came up with that joke, but clearly I didn't. Lots of interviews with game developers who incorporate death in interesting ways. Again, from around like 2018-ish, I think. So a little brief detour into death positivity here, because I think A Mortician's Tale is actually one of the first games that I'm aware of that really like explicitly invoked the idea of death positivity as like a design pillar. So death positivity is a term. It did not originate as a concept with Caitlin Dowdy, but she coined this specific term and popularized it. She's kind of like a celebrity mortician. I guess there are a few of those in the world. So likely if you've done any reading about this, you've encountered her. And it draws on the idea of sex positivity, and the parallels there are not this. It's not saying, it's not like prescriptive. And it's certainly not saying that we should love death or be dying more. But it is saying if we can get comfortable talking about it, we can empower ourselves, we can remove the stigma, we can advocate for change. So yeah, since Gabby's talk and podcast, there have been some more notable games that have been explicitly death positive. Death and Taxes is a kind of Papers, Please like game where you are deciding who lives and who dies in the afterlife. And there's a great documentary about Spell Collectiva. I might be mispronouncing that. But it's like a indie game collective in Sweden where this studio did most of their work on this game. And so they follow the development of that game. And it is very explicitly, again, about this lead designer's experience with losing family and trying to find ways to talk about it. I also just mentioned Spiritfarer here is another more recent game that I actually didn't know this until I was researching this presentation, but they actually did research at end-of-life care facilities and collected stories from their staff about experiences with death. Does anyone want to guess? Anyone who's not Matt want to guess what my personal favorite game that engages with death in a compelling way is? That's not on this list yet. Or how about this? Does anyone want to call out one of their favorite games that didn't make this list?
Moment of Islands.
Ooh, Moment of Islands. I'm going to have to write that one down. Yeah. Outer Wilds was mine. I don't think it's a game that is necessarily talked about primarily as a death game, but it's a game where you die again and again and again. It's all the different ways the universe and space can kill you. And it's actually one of the games that has helped me the most in my personal journey with accepting mortality. But I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to say too much more yet. Okay. Anyone want to take a stab, though, at what all of these games have in common with each other? Yes, other than that and other than being video game. Yeah. A loop. Okay. Yeah. That is definitely true for several of them. Yeah. Yeah.
Encouraging you to look at that narrative aspect of games. It's not just the like you die and then you move on at the beginning of the level. It is encouraging like some kind of reflection on what it means to die within the game and what aspects it can tell you about the character itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely what makes all of these games meaningful to me. The specific thing that I was thinking of for the purposes of this talk is that they happen to all be single player games. And my original goal was to spark conversations about death with another person. And so unless someone else has gone through the experience of playing this game by themselves and then wants to, is excited to chat about it afterwards, I think it's not necessarily going to make talking about death easier. And so the next step for me was to figure out if there are multiplayer death games. And this took me out of the realm of video games and into the realm of card games and board games and role playing. So there are several different kind of boxes of cards that can be used as conversation starters around death. And the organization that produced this one, I think, also hosts like death cafes where they will have a lot of these decks available on hand. And there's no real narrative to it, but it is, a structured activity that involves dialogue around death. There's also the death deck, very similar. And this board game, which unfortunately is not in existence anymore, but which again uses similar mechanics of explicit questions about death that I believe get kind of more vulnerable and intimate as you work your way toward the center of the board. But my biggest inspiration for the work that I did on this game was the work of Jane McGonigal, who actually is one of the reasons I got into game making at all. For those who are not familiar, Reality is Broken is one of the seminal works on gamification, back before that term had kind of become a buzzword to the extent that it has, and appropriated by business to drive profit. And so she has this chapter in it called Happiness Hacking, where she talks about these principles of positive psychology that can improve people's well-being on a day-to-day basis. And one of them is thinking about death for 5 minutes every day. So, I mean, I've got that one covered, I guess. And so she designed a game called Tombstone Hold'em, which she actually ran at cemeteries across the country. And it incorporated 2 of these different kind of happiness hacking principles. One was, being situated in a cemetery. It was kind of just creating an awareness and normalization of death. Another was this element of physical touch with other people. And I think the 2 things together can be pretty powerful. She also has some interesting writing in that book about the ethics of playing games in cemeteries. It's important to be respectful if there's an active service going on, and to not be rowdy. However, in general, cemeteries love having visitors, and they want more visitors. And so I think, yeah, let me see what I have next here. Yeah, I'm going to come back to that. So put a pin in cemeteries wanting to bring in more people through these sorts of activities. So Jane McGonigal actually gave a talk at Swarthmore, which is where I went to college. So I'm happy to be back in Philly. And she did a little seminar afterwards that I got to attend. And I ended up writing a paper for one of my psych courses that was called Swarthmore is Broken, How Gamification Can Make College a Healthier, Happier, and More Impactful Experience. So I was clearly already kind of a Jane McGonigal wannabe. All right. So the question is, can we combine death positivity with some of these happiness hacks and game design elements with a little bit more narrative, since I don't believe that Tombstone Hold'em had any narrative in it, and create the perfect death game? So the game that I designed has 3 different layers to it. There's the scavenger hunt, the LARP, and the crossroads, which is kind of the most mysterious layer that not a lot of players ended up discovering. And let me talk to you a little bit more about how these layers kind of interact with each other. So the idea was to have a very kind of casual and accessible point of entry for people who either are not interested in, like, who are not, don't have a lot of comfort with the theme of death or with role playing, especially. But to then have an option for people who do want to engage and kind of carry the narrative as a LARP kind of within the game. And then there was this kind of mystery at the bottom of it all that I hoped would spark curiosity about the core themes of the game. And so the way these arrows worked is, if you're doing the scavenger hunt, you could engage with characters who would help you in the scavenger hunt. So they could kind of send you back toward the scavenger hunt if you wanted to stay at that layer, or they could send you further into the story. And it was a totally supported way of playing this game to just leave the scavenger hunt behind completely and to say that there is something bigger going on here and I want to piece that together. In fact, I hoped that when we gathered every hour to kind of compare findings in this game, that some of the players would stop coming back because they were busy chasing other agenda. I wanted them to rebel against the scavenger hunt and really feel curious to engage with the death theme. So just briefly about the scavenger hunt. Remember, I put a pin in cemeteries wanting people to visit and maybe even do these sorts of activities. I ran this game at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, and they actually do death scavenger hunts there from time to time. It's not facilitated. There is I think a national organization that every once in a while will kind of send out on Instagram these lists of things to look for in cemeteries. So I think you more or less kind of go and you wander around and you do it on your own. But it was helpful to know that there was a precedent for scavenger hunts happening in this particular cemetery. This is by Talk Death. So what I did was I went and I took a lot of pictures of things that I thought looked interesting, knowing that my phone would geotag all of them, and then uploaded them to Google Photos so I could get this nice map of all of the interesting sites that I had captured. And I then gave physical maps to the players, which secretly had some of these locations marked in UV ink. And I provided cheat sheets for the NPCs, the folks who are participating in the LARP, could give out clues about which sector of the map a certain item in the scavenger hunt could be found in exchange for sort of narrative theme that would play out and answering some questions about death. So these are the worksheets that I distributed to all of the players. If you wanted to just proceed the scavenger hunt, this would basically be the game for you. There were different points based on how difficult things were to find. And it had this kind of narrative wrapper around it of spectral photogrammetry, which the idea that you're like measuring spectral energy, and you needed to take a picture of your own life energy with this kind of death energy to help my research as the character I was playing. Basically, it was an excuse to get people to hang out with their friends and take selfies. And so lots of that happened, and that made me happy to see. I think like this was one of the main levels on which the game, like, I think pretty clearly succeeded. But I had greater aspirations. I didn't just want it to be a scavenger hunt. And so I wrote a story that was centered around the three muses. Fates. It's a different game about muses. The three fates. So I was playing Lakisa, who is the fate who measures the thread. I had like a measuring tape necklace. And then we had Clotho, who weaves the thread, and Atropos, who cuts the thread. And it was kind of for the players to figure out that that's who we were. If they wanted to engage with that, it was not made obvious at the outset. But this felt like it would be a kind of a piece of mythology that people might recognize, and one that specifically involved like how much time we have left to live, and how different lengths of lives are allotted to different people. We had some other characters as well, who, like I mentioned, they would interact with players who are on the scavenger hunt in character. They would be in character. The players were not required to be in any kind of character. They would answer questions about death, and get hints. I tried to make a mapping of all of the different pieces of the LARP and how they fit together. I am not by trade a LARP designer, and I just wanted to reassure myself that like every character was interconnected in meaningful ways with other characters. More on that later, but I tried. And I made a bunch of character sheets for all of the actors. They came early. There are about 10 of these. I think we had maybe not a full cast of actors. We had maybe like 7 characters. It was a little bit flexible. Okay. And then to describe how the crossroads work. So imagine that as you're doing the scavenger hunt, there are certain places maybe that are highlighted in ultraviolet ink on your map that are more important than others, and that can kind of create ley lines through the cemetery if you identify those special places. And then imagine that at each of those special places, there is a hidden item, and they can assemble to form an artifact. So what is the purpose of that artifact? So I was inspired by this blog called The Tail End, I believe, on waitbutwhy.com, which is kind of a visualization of how much life we have left to live. And I feel like this speaks in a very real way to kind of my own anxieties about death. And so there are these different visualizations in that blog post about like how many more times this person will go to the ocean, or how many books they will read in the entirety of their life, and really kind of quantifying it. And so while people were doing the scavenger hunt, they had these vials hanging around their necks, and those had 2 different resources in the economy of the game. And I asked everyone's birth dates in advance, and people had different numbers of marbles depending on what decade of their life they were in. So the older they were, the fewer marbles that they had, and they had to spend the marble to get clues in the game. And so there was sort of a narrative where I was sort of, as one of the fates, I was stealing all of this life force, and the players, I hoped, would kind of notice that and want to rebel against it. And we had this kind of epilogue that played out at the end, where we kind of narrated, given the resources we were all left with at the end of the game, what that meant. And if the players had assembled the crossroads, they would have had an opportunity here to use it to rebalance these resources. So there were a lot of different ways to engage with this. It was very interactive, very thematic. However, it had a lot of different design concepts going on in it. It was very complicated. I tried many times to simplify it, and the final version was still not simple enough. So yeah, I was like, I have no idea even how to play test something like this without just running the whole thing. Like there really wasn't a good way to do it. So I'm running out of time here, but I want to get to my takeaways. I'm going to go through this part a little quickly, but I ran another day of games. They were death mini games. They were self-contained. I had people fill out feedback forms afterwards, so I could really gain insight into what was and wasn't working from the original event. So this was it was about 10 or so people. And yeah, it was 5 self-contained mini games, and there was a feedback system, unlike in the Life We Have Left to Live. I called it Field Day of the Dead. So there was Death Bingo. This was actually a mini game in the LARP. I had everyone do this together. So you're answering questions about death, like one of the death decks, except you're trying to find people you match with. And then you sign each other's bingo cards. So it's about finding things that you have in common and normalizing them. There was a game called Epitaph Etchings. We couldn't actually do etchings in this historic cemetery. So we took pictures and printed out stickers. And people made their own epitaphs out of the epitaphs that were on the tombstones. This reminds me a little bit of one of the mechanics in Psychic Trash Detectives that Bridget was talking about yesterday with crossing out words on trash. There's a game, my partner actually designed this one. It was one of the more narrative ones. One of the characters dies, you communicate with each other from beyond the veil of death. I think they did a really lovely job with putting their own original art into this game and pulling it together. And then there was Death's Blessing, which was another piece of the LARP that a lot of players did not actually get to experience, which essentially the main game mechanic here is lying still with your arms folded over your chest and your eyes closed. There's a little bit of narrative framing around it, but essentially it's kind of a trust and letting go exercise where you just stay there until you're told that you can move on. So what did I learn from all of this? So I mentioned I would come back to this chart here. One of the main issues in the LARP was that it had 2 big bottlenecks. You can see that the players and Lakeith's here have so many edges coming in and out of them. So what did that actually mean for the experience? I was Lakeith's. I was the host. I had trouble casting myself as anyone other than this character because this character kind of needed to be at the center of it. As a result, I was not able to fully engage with the experience because I was so busy running the game. It also meant that a lot of things had to go through me in a more centralized way than I would have liked. And then the players, there were things for the NPCs, like the people in the LARP, to do without player interaction, but most of it did require the players to be curious and to initiate that contact. And I think that resulted in people who were really excited about the LARP aspect kind of being a little bit more isolated and standing around waiting for the players to take interest and not just do the scavenger hunt. And yeah, I really hoped that the players would dig into those deeper layers. But remember, the players who were doing the scavenger hunt were the ones who decided that they didn't want to be a part of the LARP when they signed up for this game. And so I think I recently did this LARP retreat, and here I am doing something in character, which was one of my bigger character moments, where I kind of did something that was not fully scripted or structured. It takes a lot to build up to like having agency in a LARP and actually like taking the reins. Like this LARP retreat was so much of like theater exercises and consent practice and character building, very little of the actual LARP itself. And with all of that, that's kind of what it took for someone to be like, no, I want to change the story. I want to participate in the story. And so it was a lot. It was a very tall order for me to expect that the players doing the scavenger hunt without a little bit more railroading would choose the deeper layers of the experience. Okay. Got like 2 minutes maybe. So I had people score in a few different categories. Once again, the emoji aren't showing up here. A few of the games from the Field Day of the Dead. And there are a couple of just like quick, not super, like this would not hold up to scientific scrutiny, but a couple of quick kind of observations I wanted to share here. One is that the games that had the strongest narrative elements, also people said had the greatest impact. So narrative helps drive engagement with death. Not a huge surprise, but it was kind of nice to see that reinforced. Also, on the other hand, the one game that people said had the strongest gameplay was also the one that was the most fun. So gameplay and narrative, you got to do both. Huge surprise, groundbreaking. But I got some really nice comments that made me feel like I was on the right track. People talked about being able to put their thoughts about death into their own words. the pain of building up a relationship and character and then breaking that relationship or losing part of it, and this kind of resonance with their own perceptions of illness and dying. So that was wonderful to hear. And I got this really sweet letter from someone after the life we have left to live, and just pulling out a few phrases. They said that the experience was ironically life-giving, and it made them think about what big things they want to accomplish given the time and means at their disposal. So I just wanted to end on that note, because even though this is very much experimental and a learning process, clearly it did connect for some people. And, maybe that's enough for me to feel like I can die happy. So problem solved. All right, that's it. I'm guessing we don't have time for questions right now.
Well, there is the Discord, so if anyone has questions, hopefully, I don't know if you're around to answer them.
Yeah. Yeah, I will try to check Discord. I'll also be around this afternoon. So if anyone wants to chat more about this or has done work in this area, I'd love to connect with you. Thank you again.